the evidence for anti-Semitism on the Columbia campus, and I say this as a Jew, has just been completely lame and unconvincing. Students brought charges against me last spring. I'm waiting to hear whether I will be another person thrown to the lions. It does not seem the university is going to respect any limits. They really want to throw fresh meat to the Trump administration.
Is there a sense that the faculty and the students are being surveilled on campus?
Oh, absolutely. If there's evidence, by all means, show it to us. There isn't any.
Surely by now, you've heard about Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian graduate of Columbia University who played a prominent role in the university's Gaza Solidarity student protests over the past year. Now, his recent arrest in the US has sent shockwaves, raising serious concerns about free speech and pro-Palestinian activism on US campuses. But what's happening inside Columbia today, especially in light of Trump's abrupt decision to cancel $400 million in federal funding, throwing the university into turmoil and imposing a list of demands it must meet before the funding is reinstated? So what's the mood on campus? What are faculty members saying? And what precedent does this set for students and universities across the US? Joining us shortly is Bruce Robbins, a humanities professor at Columbia University, to make sense of it all. And he joins us now from New York. Professor Bruce Robbins, thank you so much for coming back again on Real Talk. I appreciate you taking the time, sir.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Let's just jump right into it. There's so much happening on US campuses, specifically Columbia. How are you seeing the case and arrest of Mahmoud Khalil play out right now?
How am I seeing it? I think everybody I know is thinking about that pretty much more than they're thinking about anything else. Ordinary concerns have kind of disappeared. What will I have for breakfast? What will I have for dinner? How will I fill my day? People are thinking about him. And what seems to us the unprecedented assault on not just on the protesters of Israeli violence in Gaza, but an assault on free speech on American campuses, and especially on foreign students, and probably not just foreign students, but foreigners in general. Anybody who's not a U.S. citizen. Legally, it seems clear. Many people have commented on this, that Mahmoud Khalil, had every right to free speech as a legal resident of the United States. And not only that, I mean, you probably have heard this, but was kind of an exemplary citizen, I would say, citizen in the strong sense, very reasonable, able to get along with people, good at listening to the views of others. Everybody who's ever worked with him has said the highest words.
Have you come across him, Professor? Or have you taught him, or do you know people that knew him on campus?
I know people who knew him. I never did have a conversation with him. But one of the things people say is that many of the protesters, for what seemed to be good reasons, kept themselves masked because they didn't want to be identified, fearing that if they were identified, terrible things could happen to them. He did not mask himself. It's like he was very happy to say, here I am, here's who I am. I have nothing to be ashamed of. I should have nothing to worry about. I'm speaking freely on a subject that I have every right to speak about. Here I am. And for someone like that to be arrested, for them to just come to his apartment, in front of his wife, 8 months pregnant, and drag him off and then send him off to Louisiana. It's a horrifying scenario. I don't use the word fascist lightly, but the least I can say is it seems unprecedented in its authoritarianism. And a lot of people are feeling if they can do this to him, they can do it to anyone.
How complicit do you think Columbia is in his arrest? Because as I'm sure you know, there were reports that he's alerted the university about a day before he was arrested. He asked for protection, actually.
That's right. I think that's a very important fact, and more should be made of it. Not everybody knew this initially. What we thought, those of us who didn't know this, that includes me, is that the university should have stepped up and said, he's not being accused of any crime. There is no crime he seems to have committed. He seems to have done nothing but exercise his free speech rights. Columbia should have said, you can't come onto our campus and arrest people like this. It should have stood up to the Trump administration in some manner. And no mention of him was made initially. And after that, of course, we found, as you just said, that he in fact had asked for protection from the university and he didn't get it. And I'm sure other people are not getting it either. You probably know this. There is the case of Ranjani Srinivasan. The government is saying that she self-deported.
To
Well,
Canada, yes.
to Canada. Well, self-deporting, what does it mean? It means the cops came to her apartment and banged on the door 2 nights in a row, and it was clear that they were coming for her. So she left her cat and she ran. And, that's not self-deporting. That is trying not to get yourself arrested. The other story that you possibly don't know, but possibly you do, is the Grant Minor story. That is to say, um, one of the PhD students in my department who did participate in the occupation of Hinds Hall, um, and everybody knew this, and it had been a year since that happened, or almost a year. And Columbia expelled him on that charge that he had participated in the occupation of Hinds Hall, the day before he was supposed to represent the graduate student union in contract negotiations. So it's two evil faces of the university at once. The university, which fought tooth and nail and paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to stop the graduate students from forming a union, and the university, which of course has been complicit in the violence in Gaza. Both of those things got concentrated in the person of Grant Minor, whom they expelled the day before the contract negotiations were supposed to start. They canceled the beginning of the contract negotiations. But Columbia is a very confusing place right now. I went to the demonstration that was called in defense of Grant Minor and got kind of stopped because there was another demonstration that I had to sort of walk through in order to get to the first demonstration. A lot of people are very, very angry at the university and the university's appeasement of the Trump administration. And many of us, I hope this doesn't preempt one of your questions, don't really know what to do about it other than to make statements and have demonstrations because it feels like something more should be done. Something more has to be done. But I think, academics are not great at organizing ourselves. We sort of go off into our individual projects and I'm writing this and I'm doing that. And it's very hard to get us to get together and say, okay, we have to do something together because otherwise this assault on the university is going to go on, and our leadership is not defending us.
And the case of your student is hardly an isolated case because the university announced that there were 22 students who were either expelled, suspended, or have their degrees revoked because of their participation in the protest at Hamilton
That's
Hall.
right. It does not seem the university is going to respect any limits. They really want to throw fresh meat to the Trump administration to show how eager they are to cooperate with the Trump administration. So this goes back before the Trump administration. This goes
Yes,
back to our previous president,
Manouche
who
Shafik.
exactly when she testified in Congress, in the House of Representatives, was told Colombia is not doing anything enough to combat the wave of anti-Semitism on the Columbia campus. And what she had to say on that occasion was, if there had been a real wave of anti-Semitism on the Columbia campus, that would be, of course, a serious problem. And if people were threatening genocide against the Jews on the Columbia campus, then there might be limits to free speech. We would limit their free speech if it was genocidal. But there has been no wave of anti-Semitism on the Columbia campus, and there has been no genocidal speech. There has just been reasonable speech on behalf of justice in Palestine. That's all there has been. She absolutely refused to make this sort of basic move. I agree with you. If anti-Semitism were an enormous problem on the Columbia campus, of course we would do something. But to use the word intifada is not to be anti-Semitic. And the evidence for anti-Semitism on the Columbia campus, and I say this as a Jew, has just been completely lame and unconvincing. And the administration has never wanted to even entertain the idea that there might be a problem with its own exhibiting of evidence for supposed anti-Semitism.
But the Trump administration has canceled 400 million in federal funding over that claim, over this narrative that Columbia failed to combat anti-Semitism on campus. And I'll ask you this. I know you're saying as a Jewish faculty member there is no, you're saying that there is no cases of anti-Semitism on campus, or the fact that it's not rife with anti-Semitism as they're
Right. It's a
pushing.
matter of degree, of course.
But you've been with the university for what, 20, 24, 25 years now, Professor?
Yeah.
Is this the highest when it comes to tensions? Is this the most it's ever been when it comes to these accusations of anti-Semitism on campus?
It's hard to compare. I don't know exactly how a comparison would work. There have been earlier moments when the pro-Israel lobby attacked Columbia faculty, and the press was full of claims that there was anti-Semitism on the Columbia campus. They tried to get faculty members thrown out. There was an investigation by the president. This is in the early 2000s, the so-called David Project, which turned out to be funded by, from above, but students were kind of instigated to make complaints. Um, so there was a lot of tension on campus then. I I do think that today it's worse. I mean, it was bad then, and it was people I knew who were accused ridiculously of things that they were not guilty of. Um, and there were, of course, newspapers and television stations that were happy to broadcast these accusations as if they were true. This does seem unprecedented to me. The degree of it and the degree of threat, the broadness of the threat seems to me worse than I've ever seen in my 24, 25 years.
And you mentioned Manoush Shafiq, the previous president, who was, widely criticized, to say the least, because of the fact that she called the police on her students to come on campus. Now, that's what we spoke about, you and I, about a year ago in our last interview. Shafiq has been pushed out. There's a new interim president right now. How does that compare to the events of the past year?
Well, first of all, security is still there, and one of the basic complaints of students, faculty, and the community, which generally, I don't know if you see how the Columbia campus is laid out, but people wanting to walk from Broadway to Amsterdam um, need to walk through the Columbia campus, and for more than a year now, they haven't been allowed to. If you don't have a Columbia ID, you can't get through. So there's been this a complaint about the closure of the campus and about the security. The word on the street is that the private security company, this is in addition to the police, is actually associated with the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons, who in American history have played a very ugly role in basically in violence against unions. Anyway, I don't know that for a fact. I just know that there's a general unease about how much security the administration feels it needs.
Is there a sense that the faculty and the students are being surveilled on campus?
Oh, absolutely. Not only do you have to present an ID to get onto campus, but there are security members wandering around inside and outside the campus looking for um, suspicious activity, looking into your eyes. Are you the sort of person who might make difficulty? There's been lots and lots of surveillance of students at their dorms. There is a thing called ICE Watch now that the Trump administration has this program of deportations, and it clearly targeting students who have been involved in some way or another in activism. Um, so it's not just the ordinary police, but ICE looking for people that they can deport. So the securitization is definitely at a level that we have never seen. Um, and that's hopefully going to galvanize people also in a way that we've never seen because the threat is that much broader. Colombia has been a magnet for brilliant students from around the world who want to take advantage in one way or another of the kind of resources that Colombia offers. And these people are all now targets.
Why do you think Colombia is a lightning rod for these issues?
Oh, it's clear. I mean, not just that Colombia is where the encampment started last April, but Colombia for decades and decades has been a unique place in which matters concerning Palestine could be studied and discussed. There is the heroic role of my friend and teacher, Edward Said. There is the fact that the Center for Palestine Studies, the first one in the Western Hemisphere, was founded at Columbia, exists at Columbia, has, incredibly wonderful faculty, and it's putting on activities, most of which are not actually directly political, but really scholarly in the most serious possible sense. I mean, you know, these are things that distinguish Columbia from pretty much any other place. So, if the events had not already happened, I think Colombia, in any case, would be in their line of sight.
And going back to Mahmoud Khalil again, how have you seen the administration basically deal with his arrest? Because I've read from the ones that I've read, the emails that I've read, the statements that I've read that were put out by the interim president, I didn't even see her mention Mahmoud by name.
Well, that makes two of us. I mean, I don't read the blah, blah, blah of the president, frankly, with great care because I expect only blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry to be saying this, but the level of language coming out of that office is extremely disappointing for an institution like Columbia. But I have been looking, as you've been looking, for his name because the name needs to be mentioned. It's an individual, right? An individual who stands for a great deal. And so far, I have not seen his name mentioned. Um, it's just a minimum of respect. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just focusing on that, it just froze my mind. I can't think of anything other than why can't you just mention his name? All right, here's something. The New York Times has not been, from my point of view, an extremely enlightened organ of information on matters related to Palestine and Gaza. This morning, however, in its editorial, it deplored the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil. It said, okay, whatever you think about Palestine, this is absolutely unacceptable. That's the New York Times. I mean, Colombia is worse than the New York Times. The Colombia administration is more cowardly than the New York Times on this subject. That I would not have predicted that. I would have predicted actually that Colombia would have been a little bit more enlightened than the New York Times on this subject.
And can I ask you how, how you've been reflecting on this and not just that, but also basically the mood on campus?
Ah, well, um, like a lot of my colleagues, I've been asking myself how much support we have for whatever it is that we will decide we need to do, whether there, might be a strike of faculty to protest the appeasement of the Trump administration by our administration, whether, and this is very, very time intensive, we should form something like an ICE watch, that we should just stand guard outside Columbia buildings and to try to stop representatives of ICE, agents of ICE, from breaking into these buildings. If Columbia is
Wow,
not
it
going to
would get
stop
to
them,
that. You think it would get to
well,
that?
I don't know whether it'll get to that. I just say this is the kind of thing we have been talking amongst ourselves about because Colombia does not seem to be offering anything other than complete cooperation. When it says protect our students, and this is what the word comes out that comes out of the Columbia president's office says, what does that mean if it doesn't mean non-cooperation or we don't let you on campus unless you produce a warrant? You know, tell us what crime you think has been committed that would permit you to take somebody into custody. I mean, just follow the law. I mean, I don't think the law is on the government's side. The government has been completely flouting the law. And what Colombia could do, probably would have done under its previous president, before Minu Shafiq, President Bollinger, who was a legal scholar, he would at least, I think, have stood up for the law. And our present president doesn't seem to be doing that. Um, I mean, okay, free speech, that's part of the mission of the university. Nobody gets taken away because of something they said. It seems an open and shut case, right? Nobody gets taken away because of their use of their right to free speech. How incriminating can it be? How provocative can it be to the government to say that, okay, this is an institution that lives and dies with its protection of free speech. You can't interfere with free speech on this campus. But they're not saying that.
If we go now to what the Trump administration has done in terms of canceling the federal funding of 400 million, first off, how did you see that decision, or how did you see that happening on campus?
Well, I saw it both as a punishment and as a threat because the threat, I mean, Columbia gets a lot more money than that. I mean, I've seen the figure 5 billion thrown around. And this is absolutely essential money, essential to the job of research that the university depends on. Research, you know, more than half of the 400 million is devoted to medical research into things like heart disease and dementia and so on, which is clearly in the public good, which is why the government, you know, agrees to support it. Um, so, you know, it can do an enormous amount of harm. Um, and, you know, I think the administration, and one simple interpretation of the administration's behavior is that they're just terrified that, you know, more money is going to get cut off. And they've chosen to appease rather than contest in court. I mean, as
By
I
giving
said,
concessions, basically.
as as I said a minute ago, this is money that has been uh, decided by Congress to apportion to um, you know, to the institutions that get it. Does the executive by fiat have the right to say, I don't care what Congress has said it will do with this money. It's not going to go, you know, where we don't want it to go. Um, so the obvious alternative would be to say, you don't have the right to cut off this money, so we're going to fight you in court. Instead, they say, no, 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 we're totally on your side. We love you. We will we will throw out protesters. We will fight an anti-Semitism that doesn't exist. We'll do anything you say. Just keep giving us the money. And that's, how shall I say, really unprincipled. Even the Times editorial that I mentioned this morning says this is a very disappointing position for university administrators to take, and they can do better. And we on campus certainly feel that.
But even if the university was giving concessions to the Trump government, it doesn't seem to be enough because, as you've seen, the Trump administration released a list of demands that the university has to meet before it
That's right.
reconsiders giving back the funding. So again, how far will this go? Because one of the demands is, you know, accepting the IHRA definition, which conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, as you know. And then there's the other one of the other demands, which is placing the Mises department, which is the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies department at Columbia, under academic receivership, which means that an outside chair would have to come in, basically. Again, in terms of precedents and in terms of what this is saying and in terms of what the university, or how far the university can keep going and keep giving to appease the Trump government.
Yeah, well, hey, you said everything that I wanted to say. I'm afraid that there are no limits, that the more they offer the Trump administration, the more the Trump administration is going to ask. And the five demands in that letter are absolutely unacceptable. So, what we on the faculty are hoping is that finally they have crossed a line, the government has crossed a line, and will force the Columbia administration to say, I'm sorry, what you're asking for now cannot possibly be acceptable. Um, I would like the university, although this is probably a vain hope, I would like them to use the word McCarthyism and to refer to the kinds of pressures in the 50s that were put on universities uh, under McCarthy uh, in the name of anti-communism, because it seems to me that Palestine and support for Hamas has become supposed support for Hamas, of which even Mahmoud Khalil hasn't. There's no evidence that he, in fact, supported Hamas.
No,
Anyway,
and
but
even on social media, just to add quickly, Professor, even on social media, the claims that he was giving out pamphlets that were in support of Hamas were unverified reports on social media.
the lack of evidence for anything that the government has said against him is astonishing. I mean, okay, it shouldn't be astonishing because in general, our president, that is the president of the United States, is pretty well known around the world for saying things that are not true. And he puts people in his government who also say things that are not true. That should not be astonishing. What should be astonishing is that the Columbia administration does not call them on these things and just say, show us the evidence. I mean, this is our university. We believe in rationality, evidence, procedure. If there's evidence, by all means, show it to us. There isn't any. McCarthy was famous for gesturing with a piece of paper on which he said, I have a list here of known communists who are working for the State Department or working for the government. And it was a complete falsehood. There was no such list, right? It's exactly what the Trump administration is doing, and our administration, the Columbia administration, is not calling them on it. So that kind of interference in the daily running of the university, what gets taught, who teaches it, what students get recruited to study, no university that is worthy of the name can accept demands like that. So my prediction is that the administration of Columbia will say, okay, you have overstepped. You're going too far now. Um, you can't ask us these things, and we can't give in to those demands. As far as I know, that hasn't been said yet. I could be, a day behind on that, but I think I would have heard if they had said any such thing. But they cannot afford to call themselves a university and to give in to those demands.
I'm going to read you a quote that was in the New York Times the other day, and it was by they were quoting the dean of the journalism school at Columbia. And this is what he reportedly was saying to students. He said, quote, if you have a social media page, make sure it's not filled with commentary on the Middle East. And then he continued on saying, nobody can protect you. These are dangerous times.
Yeah, yeah, those are words that have gone all over the place. He's a very respected figure. I assume that in saying that, he was just trying to give very good practical advice to all the international students in particular at the journalism school. That he was not saying, let's stop talking about the Middle East so that we don't get in trouble. Let's give the government what it wants in that sense, that we just go silent on even the worst human rights violations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, those words could obviously go in both those directions. They could just be protection. I mean, I have a daughter who works on Palestine, and as her father, what am I going to tell her to do right now? I mean, she's afraid, although she's an American citizen. But anybody who has anything to do with Palestine these days has got to be afraid.
But even I'm more fixated on the words nobody can protect you. It
But
gives off the impression that, the university at the end of the day does not have its students' backs.
that is a correct impression. That is to say, nobody can protect you. The other way to take that, maybe it's not the exact words, is don't expect that they will protect you because I think they could, but it would be a fight, and they would have to say, maybe we are endangering further public funding by coming out swinging against this. Um, but we have no choice. We just have to do it. Sometimes you just have to say, here I stand. I'm going to fight this. I can't accept it. Even if I stand possibly to suffer as a result of it. It's war. And I'm afraid in this case it is war. In order for the university to protect all those people that Jelani Cobb was talking to, it would have to stand up. And so far, it doesn't seem to me that it has stood up. In fact, worse than that, it has gone on and on with the blah, blah, blah. We care about our students. Protecting our students is our primary mission. We care about nothing as much as protecting our students, but nothing concrete about actual steps to protect anyone or about actual threats that students need to be protected from.
And for the faculty members that do choose to speak out, Professor, like yourself and like other, we've seen a few other Columbia faculty members come out and do interviews. Are there no fears of repercussions?
There are quite a few of my colleagues who have been making wonderful um, statements of principle. The American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, which has a strong chapter on our campus, has been wonderful. Immediately organized a press conference in support of Mahmoud Khalil, in which two rabbis spoke, lots of Jewish speakers, to say this is absolutely deplorable and unacceptable. The AAUP has been great and has I don't think anybody on it has thought for a second that there might be personal repercussions for them. I personally, I suppose, if I were a little bit more rational, might worry about my own status because students brought charges against me last spring, um, basically because I invited my class to visit the encampment on April 22nd. The circumstances were quite special because the class I was teaching was a class on atrocity, about which I've written a book. People are welcome to buy it with Stanford University Press called Atrocity, Literary History. Anyway, the class was on atrocity, and from the beginning of the semester, I had put on the syllabus that the last week would be a discussion of atrocity with reference to Gaza. I had said that the readings were to be announced, TBA, and I invited everyone in the class to suggest readings that they thought would be useful for their classmates to read about, atrocity as a concept relevant to Gaza since October 7th, 2023. I didn't, of course, know there was going to be an encampment. And then suddenly there was, and on the day when we were supposed to talk about atrocity in Gaza. So I said to my class, look, under the circumstances, it would seem absurd for us not to visit this demonstration, which has been put on by your fellow students against atrocity in Gaza when atrocity in Gaza is on our syllabus. But if anybody is uncomfortable, I said, you should absolutely not feel that you have to come to this class. There will be no consequences for you not coming to this class. But anybody who wants to go, I think it's a very rare historic opportunity for us to take the subject on our syllabus to the encampment, which is a few steps away. So I don't know, maybe half the class came with me, maybe a little more, I don't know. And two students who are anonymous to shield them from retaliation brought charges that I had interfered with their equal opportunity to get an education by inviting the class to the encampment. And those charges are still pending. And with everything that's happening on the Columbia campus, I had went through two hearings. I brought a lawyer. They asked me all kinds of questions. I know that they interviewed for hours students from my class. I'm waiting to hear whether I will be another person thrown to the lions, as it were, where they can say, here's somebody who, you know, um, took his students to the encampment, and we are going to punish him for this somehow. I have no idea. I'm awaiting judgment as we speak.
Is this the first that you're speaking about this, Professor?
Well, I mean, you mean in public?
Yeah,
I guess,
publicly.
yeah, I suppose I haven't. That's true. I think I have not said this.
And what has that process been like? I mean, what's been going through your mind throughout this whole time? I mean, first when you first found out that there were these charges brought against you.
I thought it was funny.
Funny.
Well, I mean, comical
Sure.
in the sense that it was so self-evidently the right thing to do by, my standards. Um, and it so clearly did not have any impact on any students who might have felt uncomfortable doing this because there would be no consequences for them missing one class. Students miss classes all the time without any excuse. I don't even take attendance. So the idea that somebody could complain about this, it seemed to me as grotesque as it's one of the other charges that I had said something about the fact that there were differences of opinion in my family at Thanksgiving meals, um, but we all managed to get together in spite of our differences of opinion on Israel, Palestine, Gaza. Um, Even that I had confessed to some family discomfort seemed to be to whoever it was who made the charges grounds for that I had violated some principle or even some law. It seems I my first reaction was they must be kidding. How can they possibly think that this is? I asked my interrogators whether they recognize the category of the frivolous charge. That is to say, a charge which, even if true, would not be worth pursuing. And they did not say that they recognized the category of the frivolous charge. I know legally there is such a thing. That is, judges are empowered to say, don't be silly, this is not worth pursuing. And it's what I would have expected the Columbia administration to say, but they didn't.
How much of your stance on Israel Palestine, specifically your criticism of Israel's war on Gaza, is impacting these charges?
I have no idea. They don't tell me anything. Months after the first hearing, I asked them, so new, what about, what are you, what's your, when am I going to hear um, about these charges? And they wrote back and said, actually, there are more charges, so we have to have another hearing. So
More charges.
more charges. Anyway, they're the fact that I, on the next day, held class in the classroom. Normally, they turned that into charges, which were also ridiculous since the university had not said that you couldn't meet in your classroom. So I thought, okay, if there's such a thing as a frivolous charge, that's a frivolous charge. Anyway, I had the second hearing, and again, time went by, and time went by, and time went by, and I wrote probably about a month ago, and I said, so, am I going to hear? And they said, the process is in its concluding phases, and you should hear within a few weeks. So a few weeks have gone by, and I have not heard. I think that whoever it is who makes decisions up there in the administration is saying, probably the lawyers, um, is this a good person that we can use to appease the Republicans? That is, if we punish him, will they keep the money flowing? will that help us make the case that we are dealing with anti-Semitism and, you know, make the government love us and fund us? I speak with a certain bitterness, and I apologize because it is a little bit personal. When these charges, as I say, first came down, I thought they were comical. With the way things have played out recently, in the last month or so, with the threat of deportation and people being arrested without charges for exercise of their free speech, I no longer think it's comical. Now I think the likelihood of them punishing a lot more people, including faculty who've been there for 25 years, including Jewish faculty who've been there for 25 years, all this seems much less improbable than it seemed months ago when the charges first came down.
And how are you even processing all of this? I will move on because I don't want to stay here. I understand it's an ongoing thing, but how are you processing all of this, Professor?
Processing is a more respectable word than I think I would use myself. I just worry. I have trouble sleeping. I have to imagine my life. I'm old enough so that at some point soon I would be retiring anyway, but I'm suddenly thinking that retirement might be much more imminent than I had imagined. I mean, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but if they try to retire me, to actually get rid of me, I will probably fight it and make as big of a to-do about this, as loud a series of noises, as much bad publicity for them as I can possibly make. And I will feel good doing it. And that will probably take a couple of years right through to my retirement anyway. So in that sense, worry, it's also okay if they really want to fight on this. Yeah, I'm ready to fight it.
And I was going to ask you this question anyway, but even without knowing what you just shared, but what are your biggest fears right now in terms of everything that's going on?
Well, my biggest fears are a continuation of the policy of appeasement on the part of the university, which will not work because it will just invite the Republicans to interfere more and more and more in the workings of the university. And I fear ICE on campus, the arrest and deportation of some of our finest students, a climate of terror and silencing of free speech because people are just terrified to open their mouths and say what they're thinking, which means the university would no longer be a university. That's what I'm thinking, and that's what I think many people are thinking.
I mean, in hindsight, Professor, do you think the students went wrong at any stage? I mean, do you think that they could have done things a bit differently over the past year?
You mean the students who've been protesting
Yes.
over Gaza?
Yes. Yes.
I'm a faculty member. I probably think more like a faculty member. Most likely, I would not say have disrupted the class of an Israeli history professor the way a very small group of students decided to do. One of the things I said about the encampments last spring is that in spite of charges, they were not disruptive. They were in an enclosed space. They were not trying to disrupt anything. I mean, it's possible that, some people would say they should have tried harder to disrupt the ordinary working of campus, but they didn't. They were so civilized. They were, in some ways, extremely moderate. And the idea that it's against people like that that the president called in the police. When the police chief said, "There's no violent disruption here. You don't need us." But, Minu Shafiq wanted to satisfy the blood appetite of the Republicans by calling in the police, even when the police didn't think the police needed to be called in. Um, so, I mean, those students I really have no complaint about whatsoever. I understand that legally, politically, the occupation of a building has a different status. I think it needs to be said that the property damage from the occupation of Hinds Hall was almost entirely done by the police, that it was a police firearm that went off, and it was a blessing that nobody was hurt by that. But it's true that when you occupy a building, you are escalating rather than merely the encampment, which happened before. When you disrupt somebody's normal classroom, you are again escalating. But um, that was not my decision. And okay, I mean, I respect the people who decided differently. I wouldn't have done it myself, but I understand that they got very, very, very frustrated because the university administration has been so unyielding on anything involving this issue.
Now that you're directly, affected by it as well, how are you looking at this moment, this extraordinary moment in the U.S.?
Well, I'm going to say something a little bit impractical, but it goes in a way with the fact that I can't look at Trump and say things were great under Biden. Look how terrible they are under Trump. Because as we know, those of us who've been paying a lot of attention, for example, to Gaza, the Biden administration is responsible for that genocide. Well, things under the Biden administration, things before Trump, were in some ways, not good, right? And those of us with a little bit of vision, we have to remember how bad the status quo was before Trump came into office. So I, for example, don't think that very, very wealthy schools like Columbia, which have resources that public universities could only dream of having, that it's fine for them to protect their resources and, for us to go back to or keep uh, a situation of such inequality. So there's a local candidate here in New York for mayor, Zoran Mamdani, who has backed a proposal that some of the taxation, that there should be a higher tax, which Trump also wants, but for different reasons, on the profits from endowments of wealthy institutions, and that money should go to institutions like the City University of New York, which are less well endowed. Let's redistribute the wealth. In other words, among the institutions of higher education. I would like to see Columbia, in its wisdom, which I really doubt it has, say, that's a great idea. Let us share some of our wealth with the City University of New York, where, by the way, there were also big protests um, about Gaza. So, I'm not a defender of the pre-Trump status quo in America. I think we have to remember how much the responsibility for the fact that Trump got elected depends on inequalities and injustices that were there, including, of course, the Biden administration's support for the genocide in Gaza. I mean, there are a lot of people who stayed home, or probably more likely stayed home, who didn't vote for Kamala Harris, or who did vote for Trump because they were disgusted by the Biden administration's behavior in Gaza.
And if there's anyone listening to you from the Columbia administration right now, which could be likely, what is it that you would want to tell them?
I would want to tell them to stand up for the principles that make a university a university. So the defense of free speech, for example, which means the defense of students like Mahmoud Khalil, and all the other ones who are threatened. That's what a university is. Now, what I was just saying was asking for something um, more difficult, I think, than merely a defense of free speech, a defense of the autonomy of the university, which is that redistribution of resources. And I feel like a fool to be even mentioning it when, the defense of the university as it existed before the Trump administration is so urgent a matter. But you ask me these questions and I just go on and on and on about whatever it is that I'm thinking.
And before I let you go, Professor, I want to go back if I can. You're on leave, but obviously this is something that is taking up so much of your thinking space. What is it that you're hoping for the most? And that'll be my closing question.
Well, I'm going to answer that the same way I answered really your last question. I am hoping that the demands that the Trump administration has made on the university, on Columbia, have finally crossed the line in Columbia's own, from Columbia's own viewpoint. And that it's time now for them to say, okay, you're holding this sword over us of uh, cutting the funding, but we have to stand up for who we are. And now we're going to do it. And we're going to protect our foreign students, our non-citizen students, our green card students. We're going to protect the right of everybody to speak freely on campus. Um, and there's nothing to be ashamed of here. And we're going to fight the withdrawal of the funds in court because we don't think you have the right actually to cut these funds.
And we'll leave it here, Professor Bruce Robbins. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on Real Talk. I wish you the best with everything, and I do hope that you come back for another conversation soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.